Tonight, as an open evening, is really our opportunity to bring some legs and some life into the information that is currently uploaded on our website, and to really give you an opportunity to also get some more information, meet Maria, and also to have an open forum for questions that always come up. And question time, we will allow time at the end. So I wanted to introduce Maria to you all, and then Maria will take the floor. So Maria and I met in well, we met before February, but we met with regards to this training back in February. And for those of you who know me well and know Moksha well, there's only been one other facilitator that we have brought into Moksha to deliver a training other than ourselves, and Maria is the second. And so when we both had our meeting together to talk about this training, it was something that both of us really intuitively felt was really needed. For those of you who are yoga teachers already, or meditation and mindfulness teachers, you will already know that these practices that we work on, that we teach, that we share, that we support, often in our students brings trauma to the surface that they may not consciously have an awareness of. For all of us who practice, irrespective of how long you've been practicing for, you will know that on an energetic, on an emotional, on a psychosomatic level, these practices really shift and move and bring a lot to the surface. In the last 18 months particularly, more research is also showing how trauma responsive and trauma informed training is needed within the yoga space and the meditation and mindfulness space. The training has also been catered for allied health practitioners who want to bring in more yoga techniques, practices that are underpinning and really supportive of the patients and the clients that they see. So Maria has over 22 years in social work, working with a number of individuals across a number of allied health forums, including working with homelessness, mental health issues, and trauma that really is fundamental with addiction and trauma associated with sexual abuse as well, and worked in fields such as human trafficking. So Maria brings a huge wealth of knowledge, including being a yoga studio owner in Greece for nearly 11 years. And so brings such a wealth from both portals and has created this training for all of us. So thank you, Maria, for having the insight to bring this into the world and to birth this really important training and facilitation. So Maria, I'm now going to hand this across to you, my love. Take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emma, for a beautiful opening there, and no pressure with that introduction. It was a lovely conversation that Emma and I had back in February, and one that gave the opportunity for this teacher training to actually come alive. And so I'm very grateful for that opportunity. And just to give you a bit of a background in terms of where I come from. So I started off many years ago in terms of social work and working in different forums that Emma mentioned. And the one thing, the consistent presentation was that people were experiencing trauma at different levels, and whether that trauma was quite overt in terms of physical, sexual abuse, for example, or whether it was hidden in terms of a child witnessing violence over a number of years, or many different situations where a child, for example, may have been in a home where there was substance abuse, where one parent was incarcerated. So, and that showed us that over time, there were a number of issues that that child would then experience moving on into their lives. And it's been an interesting process, because over the last 22 or so years, I think it's a little bit more than that too. And I've actually met people that I worked with when they were children, and now they're adults. And that intergenerational trauma has continued. So they're also indicators. So if someone has experienced trauma as a child and their parents, for example, hadn't been able to deal with their own traumatic experiences, it does get passed through the different generations, and that becomes, I guess, the thing that stands out is it's a public health issue. It's becoming more mainstream. And so from that awareness, in 2009, I made a decision to pack everything up and actually leave and go to Greece to explore a different approach, a holistic approach. And that's where I started to develop my holistic approach in terms of yoga practices and how I would marry that with my social work background. And that led me to the path of completing further studies. So I've studied pretty much all my life, different types of modalities. And this is the one that really resonates with me at the moment. And that's where the trauma, the somatic-based trauma yoga was actually created from. So that marrying between the experience of noticing and witnessing a lot of trauma in individuals in the community, and then how do we actually support them in a holistic way. And so if we look at the research that is evident, and there's a lot of research overseas, and Australia is just coming forward with a lot of their own research, and it's estimated that 55% of adults have experienced childhood abuse at some point in their lives, and over 40% have been survivors of sexual assault. And so the costs to an individual and to a community are enormous. It's estimated it will be over $24 billion worth to the public health system. So as we move on through different generations, the cost to the health system is enormous. The cost to our personal well-being is enormous, to the economy is enormous. And so I feel that there's a need for this approach to come forward. And the more and more we actually work in this way, then maybe we can make a small change or a small shift in someone's life to actually support them in the process of healing. Our role isn't as, so if we are working in this way, but we're not an allied health professional, so for example, if we're a yoga teacher, our role is not to be a counsellor. It is still to be a yoga teacher and facilitator. If we're an allied health professional and we're not a yoga teacher, then our role is still to be an allied health professional, but we are gaining knowledge and a toolkit to be able to work in a trauma-sensitive or trauma-informed way. And so I think the thing that stands out is the difference between the two levels. So you'll notice that the somatic-based trauma yoga teacher training is split into two levels. There's level 1, which is our trauma-informed approach, and then we also have our trauma-responsive approach. And so as a practitioner, as a yoga teacher or allied health professional, how do we approach our work? We come from a trauma-informed perspective. So utilising a trauma lens to our work. You might say, well, how is that different to how I'm working at the moment? I'm actually being mindful of someone's experience, I'm being present, I'm trying to support someone's safety and trust. And in most cases, yes, we are working in a trauma-informed way, but this approach gives us a framework to know how to approach every situation, and not just because we're compassionate and kind individuals, that we're actually working from a framework. And this framework, a trauma-informed care approach, looks at the framework of utilising safety, trust, developing choice, empowerment, and working collaboratively, but also respecting other people's experiences and their diversity. So having that framework allows us to approach our practice or our teaching practice in a way that we utilise a trauma-informed lens. If we're an allied health professional, we also can use this lens in our work, whether it's a therapy situation or whether we're working, for example, in a hospital. We can approach every interaction that we have with individuals in this way. So in level 1, we cover the areas of the anatomy of trauma. What is trauma? What are the different types of trauma? Are we looking at post-traumatic stress, or are we looking at complex and developmental trauma? Primarily, we look at all of the different types of trauma, but there's research in regards to support that the yoga approach with complex and developmental. So that's trauma that has occurred on an ongoing basis over a number of years in the developmental phase of someone's life. And that could be, like I mentioned before, sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, emotional neglect, physical neglect, sexual assault. It could also be witnessing violence or having a family member that's been incarcerated or is experienced substance abuse or alcohol abuse in the family as well. So there's different situations. And in the level 1 approach, we're also looking at how does yoga actually influence? How does it affect? On what level do we actually support someone? And there's multiple levels. So it can be from a physical perspective, it can be a mental, emotional perspective, a spiritual one, or an energetic one. So when someone comes to us in a general yoga class or in our practice in our allied health profession, it's more than likely that someone has experienced trauma. So if you go back to that statistic that 55% of adults would have experienced some form of childhood abuse, that's 1 in 2. So half of the people that we meet have experienced trauma, and it's more than likely that some of us in this space gathering here this evening have also experienced trauma. And so it's taking the approach, a very compassionate approach to our work, but utilizing that framework. And we will be covering things such as interpersonal theory, also attachment theory, neuroscience, the neurobiology of how trauma affects the brain. And one of the key writers and researchers around this area, Bessel van der Kolk, actually says that when a child is developing, the learning brain actually moves into the survival brain. So the mechanisms that they utilize to actually learn and grow and flourish turn into a survival brain to actually survive. And many situations is about a child just surviving, creating different mechanisms in their life, in their environment to get through this particular stage of their life. And so all of those different mechanisms that someone utilizes starts to map out their experience. And then as we become adults, our experience can be re-triggered. And then we go back to our old maps, the old way that we actually responded to something. So you might notice in yourself that there's certain situations that you've been in where you're triggered for some reason and respond in a particular way and not quite aware as to why you've responded in that way. And it's generally because we've responded like that when we were in our formative years, and the old neural pathways that we created in our brain actually revert to that. So one of the ways that yoga can actually support us is to create new neural pathways, which leads us to the level 2 approach. So that is a trauma responsive approach. And being trauma responsive, we are actually utilizing a methodology to create a series of classes. For example, a course. We really recommend a course to be run over, say, 6 to 10 weeks, or if you're an allied health professional, to utilize these particular somatic tools in your approach to your work. So as a trauma responsive approach, we move through the different methodology, which is looking at how do we create. So Judith Herman is another fantastic writer on the topic of trauma, and she recognized that there's 3 different principles, and one is creating safety. One is creating an opportunity to remember and mourn the trauma, and then to connect through in our ordinary life. And so I think using those words can become quite flippant. You know, yes, we have a safe space, a safe way, a safe environment, but what does it actually mean to deliver our practice in a safe way? How do we speak in our classes? What is the language that we use to invite people to experience this particular journey that they are on? And so creating safety involves the use of language, invitational language, being able to provide an opportunity for choice. And that again comes down to our language. And then in choice, sometimes if you have 2 options in front of you, that's enough. But for some people, they need a little bit more. So then we look at the dosage of that choice. How much choice? What is the depth of that choice? And to give you an example, so say for example, you're working with someone either in a therapeutic way or in a general class, we're very prescriptive. We say, place your hand here, place your foot there, press into this part, engage those muscles here. So you're not actually creating choice for that person. In a general class, that's the way we work, and it does give an experience in itself. But when someone's experienced trauma, their power has been taken away from them. It wasn't their choice to actually hand over their power to the person that has abused them. And so part of our role is to actually empower someone through this practice. And a way to do that is to offer choice. So we use invitation. So we offer someone as a simple movement, for example, moving your head in one direction. We offer them the choice of moving it in whichever direction they wish to move it, and then to allow them to have that experience. Through that experience, so they're starting to tap into what we refer to as an interoceptive experience. This is our inner felt sense. And that's the beauty of yoga. It allows us to tap into the inner felt sense, the yoga of listening. So listening to these different feelings, sensations on all these levels that we have, the different sheaths of the body. So looking at it from a physical perspective, emotional, energetic, spiritual level, we're experiencing these different sensations through choice and having this interoceptive experience. However, we need to be very mindful that in this space where someone is just starting to notice, just starting to feel, that it becomes very overwhelming at times. So the other beautiful aspect of yoga is that there's an end point. So there's an end point to the practice in that space that they are practicing, and allowing the person to recognize that there's an end point can actually support them to know that they will be safe after their practice if they're having an overwhelming experience. So we look at all those different little facets through the methodology that we use. The other facets of a responsive approach is that mutuality, I can never say that word. So mutuality, how do we work together? And in some general classes or in our approach in therapy, we're directing. So again, we have the power. So when we work in a mutual way or a collaborative way, we are practicing with the participant in front of us. So we will move through the same movements. We will move through the same experience and also have our own experience in that space. And that is where the connection comes into it. So another very important aspect is this. So Judith Herman again, so there's some key texts. So if you do enroll in the course, when you enroll in the course, we will be giving you a key list of texts. And Judith Herman is one of a brilliant author and therapist. And she also identified that healing cannot occur in isolation. Healing occurs through connection. So the way we actually approach our trauma responsive classes is through that therapeutic alliance, through the therapeutic relationship. What does that mean? So we explore that further. And then we also have, I guess, that ability of looking at how do we influence the body-mind connection. You might know that you feel a lot of experiences in the body. It's in actual fact, 80% of the information that travels to the brain comes from our body. 20% comes from our brain to our body. So this is called the afferent. So it moves towards the brain, and the brain is the efferent to the body. And so we also know that yoga is a somatic experience. It's not a cognitive one. Yes, there's cognitive outcomes. So there's a connection. However, initially we start to have that body experience, so a somatic experience. Somatic comes from the word soma, from the ancient Greek language. And trauma does too. So trauma comes from the Greek language. It means wound. And so we utilize the practice of yoga to have that body-mind connection. We move through body shapes and forms to explore this connection. And we do it in such an interoceptive way through that relationship. The other thing that we'll be exploring, so the other aspect, is how does our autonomic nervous system influence? So we've been affected in some way through a traumatic experience, which has resulted in trauma to our body, to our mind, to our essence. So how is it that we can support the nervous system? So the intricacies of the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And we've probably all heard of the sympathetic and parasympathetic, the two sides of the nervous system, but there's also another layer, which is the vagus nerve, and how then that affects our experience of different therapies, how it affects our experience of everyday life, and then how do we regulate. The key in terms of regulation as well is we want to be able to support a participant to self-regulate, but that comes from first feeling safe and experiencing an understanding of what trust is through a relationship of co-regulation. So you might notice in a general class that someone is experiencing something, but they do trust you. So because they've known you over a period of time, so they will stay in the practice, but they may be having an overwhelming experience in that particular instance. So if that's occurring, it's creating that safe space, it's creating the safe environment, moving through their body experience in a safe way, providing that co-regulating experience. So then at some point they can start to self-regulate as well. And I guess some of the other things that, just to bring your attention back to how prevalent trauma is in our community and in our everyday lives. So if someone has experienced, for example, sexual abuse, 32% of those individuals have attempted suicide in their life. So attempted. We're 12 more times more likely to attempt suicide if we've been sexually abused in our life. So just be mindful in this moment to say as well, if you feel anything coming up through this information session, please take the time to take care of yourself as well. So take what you need in regards to self-care. Take what you need in terms of the supports that are around you. And that's one of the things, I guess, leading into through this teacher training, this course, we have a very strong component in regards to the well-being of the facilitator. So both in level 1 and in level 2, we move through different approaches and different strategies to support a facilitator to support themselves. So there'll be things such as journaling, there'll be supervision, so clinical supervision. If you've never experienced supervision, it's having a relationship with the facilitator, but we'll be running it in a way with a peer. So there'll be the facilitator, yourself and a peer to actually work through issues that you may not have worked through in the course that relate to the teaching material. There is a little note here, I'll come back to it. And so then in the responsive approach as well, there is more in-depth work in regards to facilitator well-being, which is one of the key aspects through that therapeutic relationship. To be able to do the work we do, we need to be able to take care of ourselves. So we often find that when we start a particular journey, whether it's becoming a yoga teacher or an allied health professional, we want to give so much of ourselves that sometimes we miss out on practicing ourselves in terms of our own yoga practice, our own still practice, our meditative practice. We actually leave that to the wayside, and then it actually affects our work that we do. So we really encourage in this teacher training to develop your own self-care practice, and we'll support you through that experience. To note though, when we are going through this material, this course is a teacher training. So it's not an opportunity, although there will be profound personal growth, it's not a therapy session for ourselves. So we need to make the distinction that it's definitely highly recommended that if you need support, to seek it, and we'll be able to provide you with additional resources as to where you might be able to seek support if you've had your own personal experience. And we will support you throughout the whole process. But just to note that it isn't our own therapy to move through this course, but it's more about how do I work in this way moving forward as a practitioner or an allied health professional. I think that's, yeah, I didn't realize I was going to talk for so long. But I guess it's something that is very important to me in terms of what I've noticed moving forward. How do we actually work? And I actually would like to read to you I'm very big on reading, so I'll read to you just this little quote from Bessel van der Kolk. And one of the key texts that we'll be looking at is, and you may or may not have heard of it, is The Body Keeps the Score. it is quite a heavy book if you've never read anything in terms of trauma or trauma therapy. So you might want to take snippets of it and then put it down and read something a little lighter or watch some Netflix. Often helps. Netflix often helps. So I'm just going to read to you this little quote from Bessel. So, beneath the surface of the protective parts of trauma survivors, there exists an undamaged essence, a self that is confident, curious, and calm. A self that has been sheltered from destruction by various protectors that have emerged in their effort to ensure survival. Once those protectors trust that it is safe to separate, the self will spontaneously emerge and the parts can be enlisted in the healing process. And that's the beauty of yoga. It allows us to tap into our true self, the essence of who we are. We often feel that if we've had this experience growing up, that is who we are. We've experienced trauma. So trauma raises a number of issues such as shame and feeling shame, guilt, fear, uncertainty, unworthiness, lots of emotions that sometimes we don't know where they fit or where they sit. So yoga allows us to start to have that experience and that interoceptive experience of noticing who we are and starting to blossom through in our healing journey. So if you have yourself experienced trauma, this may be an opportunity then to explore other avenues for therapy and treatment. I've been in therapy before in terms of my own personal experiences, which have allowed me to grow as an individual and have profound experiences to be able to do the work that I do. I think if I hadn't gone through those experiences, even this particular course may not have come to fruition. So it's recognizing when things are challenging for us to actually utilize the tools around us. And one of the beautiful things with yoga is it is a somatic experience, and there's evidence, lots of evidence out there that it is a science. So the science of yoga. And there's more evidence building in terms of having an experience of talk therapy. So talk therapy can be something like psychotherapy, where you go through a counseling process. And then if you layer it with a somatic experience, so something, for example, like yoga, there are by far more positive outcomes than doing one modality or the other. So it actually supports. And when we run a trauma responsive class, we actually encourage and recommend that participants do have a support in the community, whether it's a counsellor, whether it's a health professional, that it supports them if something comes up for them in and through that experience. And yeah, so I guess the other thing that I'd like to bring your attention to is just being mindful that it is an inner felt sense. It is the shift of the body's experience to come to one of safety, and through experiencing and fostering self-compassion, we ease pain and suffering. So yeah, I don't know, Emma, if you'd like to add anything to all of that.
Well, I think more than anything actually is to ask you to really share the distinction between being trauma informed and trauma responsive, because there's lots of somatic based informed trainings, but of course, as either already existing allied health practitioners or as yoga teachers, it's one thing to be informed, to see the flags and identify that trauma is present in a student or a client that we're sitting in front of. It's another thing to then extend into that responsive role as a teacher. And I know for you that was something that was really important, that level 1 and level 2 really distinguished between what it means to be trauma informed and then what it means to actually be trauma responsive. Because I think that for us, what was really key wasn't just being informed of trauma, but actually being a key role. And potentially at times, I know I've been part of a support team where I've had a student experiencing trauma and then being able to be responsive. So I'd really love for you just to share that real distinction between those two, because I think that's critical to our training being unique.
Yes. So when we are responding in a trauma-informed way, we utilize that trauma lens. So we have an understanding of what trauma is. We have an understanding of the effects of trauma. We have an understanding of the neurobiology and the neuroscience behind the trauma. But if we're in an environment where we are running a general class or moving through a counseling session or therapy session, we have that knowledge, but not necessarily the toolkit to respond to that presentation. So when we move through a trauma responsive teacher training, we start to explore the tools and the toolkit that we can use to respond in a trauma responsive way. So say, for example, you're running a trauma class, a general class, a general yoga class, and you notice that someone is having a difficult experience. And you know that something's happening for them. They're having a somatic experience, and then you're not quite sure. So you understand that they're going through something, but then if you've completed the level 1 training, you do recognize it. So yes, your instinct is to support that person. Your instinct is to approach that person and actually support them. But we have to be mindful that we work within our scope of practice. So if our scope of practice is that I have a trauma lens, then I may not be able to respond in this way to that particular individual without causing further harm. So I might say or do something that might trigger them or re-traumatize them. So I have to be very mindful that I utilize the knowledge that I have in an appropriate way. So if I'm responding in a trauma-informed way, yes, my knowledge is based in evidence. Yes, my knowledge is based in empirical evidence and science. However, I may not have the skills and the tools to actually then respond in a responsive way. So I can create a container and a safety mechanism for that particular person, but then they do leave. They leave from the general class and they've been triggered, for example. It's how do I contain them once they leave outside of that room? So it's very important to understand that when we go through a trauma-informed teacher training, you will have the knowledge. You'll have the knowledge to recognize, to identify, to be upskilled in how do you actually work in a trauma-informed way. So taking into consideration those elements of safety, trust, collaboration, etc. However, the response may not be there. So we need to be mindful that if you do respond, we could be re-triggering if we haven't got the additional knowledge to our toolkit. And being really, touching on the scope of practice is very important because we also have elements of confidentiality, privacy. We have elements of informed consent, for example. So when someone comes to a general class, there is an implied informed consent that they will participate in the practice. There is an implied consent in a lot of situations, maybe not during COVID, that we might actually physically touch a participant to assist them to move into a particular form or shape. So this implied consent is one that we start to explore, one in our informed practice, but then we build on that in our responsive teacher training. So the distinction when you move into level 2 is then exploring and gaining the skills and knowledge to be able to respond in an effective way. So you've recognized, you've identified, you know someone's having an experience, but then it's having the skills to be able to respond to that. Again, within the scope of practice, which is whether you're a teacher, yoga facilitator, or a practitioner, an allied health practitioner, still within your scope of practice. So if you are a yoga teacher, you're not the person's counselor. You're not there to provide therapy. You're there to actually facilitate the yoga practice and support them, and then to address whatever it is that's coming up for them in a supportive way, utilizing the tools that you have as well, your toolbox and the supports around you to support this particular individual. And then trauma responsive becomes even one step further, which is moving through in terms of a practice. So developing a whole series of classes, developing the screening process, the assessment process, moving through how do I market this? What are the high risk populations that I want to be able to offer this particular practice to? So I might access, for example, cancer survivors, or I might access children that have been in families that have a parent who's a substance abuser. So that allows you, so the responsive component of this training allows you to develop that into much more detail. And then also supported throughout the whole process by myself as a facilitator through your supervision. So clinical supervision is another aspect that is really that makes this course very distinct to other courses that are being offered. We take it from a clinical perspective in terms of how do I support you as a practitioner? How do I support you as a yoga teacher or allied health professional to do the work that you do? And that's just one of the key distinctions, I think, that is very important to note. That additional support is how we then create this community of yoga practitioners and allied health professionals that work in a trauma-informed way, whether it's trauma-informed or responsive. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit more, Emma, in terms of that scope of practice.
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Maria. Let's open the floor to you, and just to see any questions that you may have about the training. I'm more than happy to answer questions around technical side of it, like dates and weekends and etc. enrollment.
Yeah.
But in terms of course content, or any questions that have come up already or you were prepared for tonight, just want to open the floor so that you can ask Maria. And just to unmute before you do that, please.
I have a question.
Yes, Leanne.
Thanks. I can conceptualize, firstly, sorry, Maria, thank you.
You're welcome.
I can conceptualize how this would work in a trauma responsive yoga class, but I'm wondering if you could perhaps elaborate what it would look like in, let's say, a therapeutic context. So I work as a psychologist, predominantly with children and adolescents and some adults. I'm just wondering how you could incorporate this into the therapeutic process.
Beautiful. That's a great opportunity if you're working with children to actually start to use body-based experiences. So I'll give you an example. So I work currently working with substance users. And so part of the work that we do is obviously talk therapy, which also with children, I would imagine you do talk therapy, play therapy, as well as different other tools. So when we're utilizing the yoga somatic work in a one-to-one session or a group session with a particular population, we would move through different postures, for example, moving from one asana. So we actually explore asana and postures in the trauma work, the trauma course that we're delivering. And you would utilize, and we try to avoid words such as asana and postures. I'll explain why. So say, for example, someone has experienced sexual abuse and they've been asked to move into a posture. If we use the same word, we might be triggering. So someone may have been conditioned or set up in a particular way. And so we try to avoid that type of language. So we will use the language of forms and shapes. So if you're working with children, you would ask them to move into a particular shape, but you would move into these shapes quite slowly initially. Children may not have that same slowness as an adult, that capacity, but initially slowly, and then you would ask them to notice what that's like. Do you feel the weight onto one foot? Do you feel the weight onto the other foot? How does that feel for you to be in that particular shape or that particular form? Is there a particular way that you wish to move in this particular instance, in this moment? Giving them opportunity to use those, especially with children. You can use a lot of cue cards, so animals, pictures, etc., to move into different shapes. And so then you would explore with them in different ways. How does it feel? What do you notice? So little cues in regards to that somatic experience. So children may not have the language to actually articulate what it is that they're experiencing. They might be able to draw you a picture though. They might be able to utilize their toys to explain the particular, it depends on the age group that you're working with. So they might be able to use, so if you're familiar with psychodrama as well, we use a lot of tools such as animals, magnets, shapes, cloth, material, etc., to talk about their experience that they've had moving into this particular shape. And also you move through that particular modality with them, that tool with them, and demonstrate that it has an endpoint. So if they start to feel uncomfortable, it has an endpoint. Whereas if they've experienced trauma, it didn't have an endpoint. It actually continued. And so they continuously tried to survive in this environment. Whereas you can contain these as little snippets, little vignettes of movement, little vignettes to actually move the body in a certain way and say, oh, what does it feel like to be a very strong warrior? What does it feel like to ride a wave as a warrior, for example? And utilizing that as your toolbox. The skills that come with it. So using our imagination as an allied health professional is very important as well. So the toolkit that you will have would also be around, what is the language that I am using? Am I using language that re-triggers or re-traumatizes? Often when we have we've dissociated from our bodies, we talk about it. A lot of the time you'll notice in our general classes, we talk about the body, the breath. So it's separate to us at times. For someone who's experienced trauma, there's a separation in their mind, quite possibly. So when we talk about it in a trauma responsive way, we talk about your body, your breath, bringing it back in, creating that ability to associate again with the physical form, and then using our language to invite that, to befriend the body. So if a child is having a negative experience of moving into a particular shape, you can talk about that particular shape with them. What was the shape? Why was that uncomfortable for you? Or they might not know the word uncomfortable. So how was that for you? What is your experience of that? Is there something else that you would have preferred to do? For example, move your hand in this way or this way. And not being very directive is very important in this practice. So not saying move your right foot, move your left foot. It's about providing choice and opportunity and allowing that person, that child, to have the experience of empowering themselves, knowing that they can then create their own power to move into their body themselves and start to befriend their body. So all these little tools that we use in terms of the language, the shapes, the forms, and then your imagination as well as your skill base of being a psychologist, to marry those two together will actually create a really beautiful session of movement and also talking or drawing or playing, depending on the age of that child.
Okay. All right.
Hopefully that
you're working on it on a very visceral level.
Yes,
Which,
absolutely visceral level. That's exactly right. So you are working on a visceral level to be able to affect change somatically, which then creates that connection between the body and the mind. Correct. Okay. Absolutely. Yeah.
Can I just ask you another quick question?
Definitely.
I also really love Bessel van der Kolk's work. I didn't quite catch the name of the other one. Would you remind?
Yes. So Judith Herman.
Okay.
Trauma and recovery, or the recovery of trauma and recovery, I believe the book is called. But if you look, Judith Herman, Herman, it might be double N if I remember correctly, but she has an amazing wealth of written material if you're a reader. And the other person that is very good as well is Dr. Eric Ariel. So Ariel, Arielle, Schwartz. She's an amazing practitioner. She's a yoga teacher as well as an allied health professional, a doctor. I believe she's a psychologist with an amazing wealth of knowledge. There are other books that I will be referring to as well throughout the course. And I'm not sure if you are familiar with Deb Dana.
No.
Deb Dana is a social worker, and she actually has done a lot of work around the polyvagal theory. So polyvagal theory is Stephen Porges. Yes. And so she's done a lot of work around the polyvagal theory around self-regulation. So talking about the different strategies that you can utilize to support self-regulation, whereas Dr. Ariel Schwartz is actually looking at it from a yoga perspective, as well as marrying that allied health perspective as well.
That sounds great. Thank you. Thanks, Maria.
Which in the course we will provide lots of reading for you and lots of opportunity to explore different texts, as well as the practical there's a lot of practice in this course as well, which I didn't mention. We do have a lot of opportunities to practice how you actually start to utilize the language and the movement into these experiences. So.
Okay. And sorry, one last question.
Sure.
I promise I'll mute myself.
Oh, I love this.
Keep going, keep going.
We love this.
I just noticed with the course outline that on level 1 and level 2, there's some hours that are non-contact hours.
Correct.
And I just wondered what, what we were required to do in those hours. Yeah.
So the non-contact hours allow you to explore further reading, for example, allow you to explore a well-being practice. So there will be a journaling component as well as the supervision component. So the supervision component will be, I think in level 1, it's an hour. So 2 30-minute sessions because it's only 2 weekends. And in level 2, it'll be 2 hours, which means it's 4 30-minute sessions with the facilitator and a peer to actually explore issues. It allows you the opportunity to practice, to actually have a practice of how do I do this work? What do I do? So also we might even ask you to record your practice. So pretending you have a participant in front of you or a child, if you have a specific target population that you want to work with, and actually do a little vignette of, for example, an opening sequence or a closing sequence or a particular posture, as well as there'll be different learning activities that you'll have opportunity to also explore through the course whilst engaged in the course, but also out of hours. So there is an expectation that there is a little bit of study. So in level 1, the contact hours are 30, but the non-contact hours are 10, whereas in the level 2, you'll notice the non-contact hours are 20 hours. So there is a little bit more of an expectation around the intensity of the practice, as well as your experience of the journaling. So journaling doesn't necessarily mean you have to write things. It's about how you are able to articulate your experience, whether that's through poetry, music, it may be drawing, it may be just jotting down little snippets or finding things that relate to your experience. And that piece of work is not submitted because it's a very personal piece of work. But we do definitely recommend that you do that piece of work because it is a journey for us as well, moving through the teacher training to actually experience what we're experiencing, both somatically on a physical level, but also a cognitive level, and then integrate that in our learning.